What's going on, guys? Got another video today. This one, we're jumping into our unit on ecosystems and the interdependent relationships within ecosystems. So let's get after it, all right? So first of all, let's start off with some vocabulary. What is an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem is really like all the living and non-living things that interact with each other in a certain area, right? So it's all the organisms and how they interact with their physical environment. So let's write that down. An ecosystem is the interaction, the interaction between organisms and their physical environment. The interaction between organisms, so remember, organisms, guys, are any living thing. So an organism is a living thing, and how they interact with their physical environment. So physical environment, guys, we're talking about non-living things. So we're going to be talking about, I don't know, maybe we're talking about sunlight, air, water, anything that's non-living within an ecosystem, right? So it's the interaction between living things, organisms, and their physical environment. In this video, we're going to focus a lot on energy. Remember, energy would be part of the physical environment, something that's non-living. Energy, all the energy from life comes from the sun, right? There'd be no living things without the sun. We have to convert the energy that comes from the sun into usable energy for us, right? And we talked about another video. What does that? Photosynthesis does that. That's why photosynthesis is so amazing, because it converts sunlight energy, solar energy, into chemical energy that allows all other living things to live, right? If we can't convert that sun energy into something, there's no way to get energy and survive, right? You can't have any food. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about energy today and how it flows through ecosystems, okay? There are three strategies that organisms use, living things use to get energy. The first strategy is a type of organism that uses this strategy is called an autotroph, or a producer, right? So autotrophs, producers, right, colored in green, because what autotrophs do, auto means self, troph means energy, so these guys make their own energy. So what do you think those are? Yeah, that's right, they're plants. Plants do photosynthesis, making their own energy from the sunlight. So an autotroph, remember, means auto means self. Auto equals self, right? They make their own energy from the sun. So I can draw a little sun here. Here's my sun. They're creating energy from the sun. It's crazy, right? I wish we could do that, right? But we don't do photosynthesis. Remember, troph means energy. Energy. And these guys, autotrophs, also known as producers, right, make sugar, or their own energy, make sugar / energy from photosynthesis. Right? That's so cool, because sure, we've learned a lot that photosynthesis produces oxygen, which is really necessary, yes? But even more important than that, or maybe equally as important, is that photosynthesis is really the key to all living things, because it has to convert this energy from the sun into something that animals can use, right? Any living thing that's not a plant, that is not an autotroph and doesn't make its own energy, has to either eat an autotroph or eat something that's eaten an autotroph that it can get energy, right? Because we don't do photosynthesis, so that's pretty crazy, right? So autotrophs, that's the first strategy to get your own energy. The second type of organisms, you can be a heterotroph. So hetero, guys, hetero means different, troph means energy, so it means they get their energy from others. They don't make their own energy, right? These guys, I'm gonna draw a plant over here, right? This is my flower. Maybe a flower is an autotroph. Heterotrophs, we're talking about us, we're talking about human beings, right? We have to eat to get energy, or maybe we're talking about a wolf or a dog or something. Ooh, that was bad. Right? These are heterotrophs. So hetero means different, energy from others. So hetero equals different. So troph means energy, so get their energy from others. So gain energy from others, right? So they have to eat to get their energy. Right? They can eat a plant, or they can eat another animal that at one point ate a plant, right? That's a heterotroph. And the last type of organism we're going to talk about that gets energy is a group called decomposers. These guys are kind of cool. Decomposers are things like mushrooms, fungi, bacteria, worms. So I'm going to draw a mushroom over here. Here's my mushroom. Here's a little worm. It's my little earthworm, right? Decomposers actually, they use a different strategy, right? They don't make their own energy, but they don't necessarily eat. What they do is they break down dead material and recycle those nutrients. So decomposers are really important in an ecosystem because energy doesn't get created or destroyed, just gets recycled. Decomposers kind of start that recycling process, right? So they get their energy by breaking down dead material, right? Energy from breaking down dead matter, right? So if you've ever seen like moss on a rotting log or something like that, or even like mold on your bread if you leave it out too long, that's a decomposer. It's breaking down that material and kind of recycling the nutrients, right? So that's how it gets its own. That's how they get their energy, right? So we got autotrophs, heterotrophs, decomposers, but there's two kind of categories these guys fall into. So like I said, an autotroph is also known as a producer. So autotrophs are also known as producers. You can kind of guess what producers, what do you think that means? That's right. Produce own energy. Produce own energy. Right? So that just means they make their energy. Same thing as an autotroph. Producers and autotrophs make energy from the sunlight through photosynthesis. Heterotrophs and even decomposers are actually kind of called or considered consumers. I wonder if you can guess what it means when it says consume. That's right, they eat to get their energy. Consume. They have to consume to get their energy, right? So eat to gain energy, right? So consume, maybe they talk about consumers in like in economics because they're consumers that go buy things and use things, right? Consumers in this sense means they're eating to get their energy or they're using something else to get their energy, right? That's a heterotroph. Different others, consumers, right? Okay, so we did a lot of vocab. Ecosystems, living things and the non-living things, how they interact within an area, a given area. We talked about the different types of organisms and how they get their energies. Autotrophs are plants, do photosynthesis. Heterotrophs are like us, we eat. Decomposers, we got mushroom and bacteria and earthworms, right? They break down dead material, they're considered consumers, and autotrophs are considered producers. But we're not done, okay? There are three types of consumers. Remember, consumers, we just said, eat to get their energy. You can be an herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore. These should be maybe kind of familiar. We're just gonna go over them briefly. An herbivore, the way they get their energy is they eat plants. Right? These guys only eat plants. Only eat plants. So if I say eats plants, we're talking plants are going to be what? That's right, producers or autotrophs, right? So herbivores only eat plants. Carnivores would only eat what then? Yeah, carnivore, think carne in Spanish, right? Only eats meat, right? And then finally, if we only eat plants, only eat meat, what do you think omnivores do? Yep, that's right, they eat both. Okay, omnivores, so we'd be omnivores, so most of us, unless we're really, really strict vegetarians or something. But most human beings are omnivores. Eat both plants and animals. Right, so carnivores, maybe something like a cougar, right? So only really gonna eat meat. An herbivore would be something like a deer, really only going to eat grass and plants and things like that. Omnivores would be us, we eat both. Okay? But something important to notice here is what I have written here. Primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Because we're going to finish this video talking about food chains and food webs. And that shows how energy moves through an ecosystem. All right, if we're talking about food webs and food chains, we need to talk about what a primary consumer is. All right, so any food chain or food web always starts with a producer, because a producer has to take that energy from the sun and convert it into something that everything else can use. Right, so producers or autotrophs start a food chain, and then the first thing to eat a producer, that's called a primary. Primary means first. Primary means first, and consumer means to eat. So primary consumers are the first eaters, the first ones to eat something, right? So primary consumers, what are they going to eat? They're going to eat, producers. Primary consumers are going to eat plants. So primary consumers are always going to be either an herbivore or maybe an omnivore, because they eat plants. So either of these guys can maybe be a primary consumer. Right? Could omnivore be a primary consumer? Yeah. Okay, first one to eat a producer. And then we have a secondary consumer. So secondary consumer actually gets its energy from a primary consumer because it eats a primary consumer. You'll notice I'm drawing the arrow towards the secondary consumer because the arrow doesn't show what eats what. It's not saying the secondary consumer gets energy, eats the primary consumer. What this arrow represents is that energy is going from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer. So the arrow shows the direction of energy flow, right? So primary consumer eats producers, right? And then they are eaten by secondary consumers, right? And secondary consumers are then eaten by tertiary consumers. So secondary, you can think second, right? Tertiary means third. And you could keep going, right? You could do quaternary consumers and beyond, but we're just gonna stop here. Tertiary means third. Another thing we gotta talk about is a trophic level. A trophic level is the energy level. Think trophic, remember, means energy. Trophic level is an energy level within a food web or a food chain. So if we're talking about the first trophic level, we're gonna talk about producers. The primary consumers, this is where it gets confusing, are the second trophic level. So even though primary means first, they're the first to eat something, they're actually the second energy level. Because what's the first? That's right, producers are the first energy level or trophic level. So secondary consumers aren't the second trophic level, they are the third energy or trophic level. Right? And tertiary consumers, third to eat something, but fourth trophic level. Right? A lot of students kind of get confused here. Because you're like, secondary, second, that must mean secondary, second trophic level. No, they're actually third trophic level, right? And it's kind of hard to explain. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to draw a simple food web and a food chain and show you guys what the trophic levels look like and what the where the secondary and primary consumers would fall in one of these food webs or food chains. So first, herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, all types of consumers have to get their energy from others. Herbivores only eat plants, carnivores only eat meat, omnivores eat both. Primary consumers are the first to eat, but in the second trophic level, so they eat producers, right? That can be an herbivore or an omnivore. A secondary consumer eats a primary consumer, so that might be a carnivore or an omnivore. And tertiary might be carnivore and omnivore, right? You're not going to see an herbivore ever be a secondary consumer or tertiary consumer because they only eat plants, and plants are always the first trophic level. All right, that was a lot, but now let's do a food chain. I'm going to erase this. We're going to do a food chain, and we'll talk about an example, right? All right, so we talked about how organisms in an ecosystem get their energy. Remember, ecosystems, the interaction between the living and non-living things in a given area. So right now we're talking about the living things and interacting with energy. That's what we're focusing on today. Now a food chain, let's go black, I guess. A food chain, food chain, working on the chain. Gang. All right, so food chain is a linear model. It shows a linear direction of energy flow in an ecosystem, right? Linear model of energy flow. Energy flow. A linear model, right? Straight line. These are pretty simple. So we're going to start with the first thing that gets energy, or where all the energy starts with, always starts with the sun. Sun has all the energy, unless you're talking about rare ecosystems like the hydrothermal vents at the deep bottom of the ocean, they don't do photosynthesis. There's chemosynthesis, something like that. But for the most part, 99.999% of all energy on Earth comes from the sun. The sun's super important, which means the sun is then used by our producers. Used by our producers. Remember, producers are plants. These are also known as autotrophs, make their own energy, right? They make energy from the sun through photosynthesis. And then you're going to have your primary consumers. The first to eat. Now remember, what's going to be a primary consumer? That's going to be an herbivore or maybe an omnivore, right? They're going to eat plants, right? So energy starts with the sun. Sun is then converted into chemical energy through photosynthesis by producers. Producers are then eaten to feed the primary consumers, right? Maybe another video we'll talk about biomass and everything, but there's way more producers on Earth than organisms because they have to do photosynthesis. They have to convert that energy. That's super important, guys. I hope you guys are getting that. All right, and if we go further, we do a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer, right? So here's our first trophic level, right? Our first energy level here are plants. And here's our second trophic level. You notice how this is our second level, but our primary consumers? That's where it's getting confusing. So if we did a secondary consumer, what trophic level would they be? They'd be third trophic level. Yes, correct. All right, so that's pretty simple. So maybe the sun, maybe this is grass, maybe our producer in this example is grass. Maybe our primary consumer maybe is a grasshopper. Remember, these arrows from the sun don't represent what eats what. Remember, they're showing the direction of the energy flow. It's not saying the grasshopper eats the sun. It's saying that the sun's energy goes from the sun to the grass and from the grass to the grasshopper. Remember, arrows show the direction of energy flow. All right, last thing before we stop this video is we did food chain, super simple. Now we're going to show a food web that's more complex. It shows all the interactions within the ecosystem, not just a linear model, right? So I'm going to erase some of this stuff. We'll do a food web. Okay? All right. So, not a food chain, but a food web. Food web. And just like this sounds, we're not making a line anymore. It's not linear. We're doing a web. So it's going to show all the interactions, right? So food web has multiple, shows all food chains. Shows all the food chains in an ecosystem. Right? It shows all the food chains. So there's lots of food chains in an ecosystem. A lot of things eat different things, get their energy in different ways. So food web shows all those relationships. Right? So I can draw just a simple one as an example. Remember, what's going to start all the energy? That's right, the sun. So here's my sun down at the bottom. Sun has all the energy, and then what's going to come next? Our autotrophs are our producers. So maybe we've got some grass doing photosynthesis, right? Maybe we've got some carrots growing with photosynthesis, right? And then we're going to have our primary consumers, right? These are going to be our herbivores that only eat plants. So maybe something that eats grass is going to be, maybe a mouse eats grass. Maybe we've got a mouse. Here's our primary consumer. Maybe the mouse also gets energy from carrots. Maybe the mouse is eaten by an owl. Maybe the mouse is also eaten by a fox. And maybe the fox doesn't just eat the mouse, maybe it eats a rabbit. Right? And maybe a rabbit gets its energy from carrots. Right? Maybe a rabbit also eats grass, right? So you'll notice here, we've got lots of food chains here. Okay, these show all the food chains. Here's one food chain. Check it out. We've got one food chain here, sun, grass, mouse, owl. That's one food chain. Here's another food chain, sun, grass, rabbit, fox. Right? We got another one, sun, carrots, rabbit, fox, and we got another one, sun, grass, mouse, fox. Right? There's lots of different food chains in this food web. It shows all of the interactions. Quick review, sun has all the energy. Right? Then we have our producers or autotrophs that make their own energy through photosynthesis, grass, carrots in this example. Then our primary consumer, so here's a mouse, this is our primary consumer, but what trophic level is it? 1, 2, oh sorry, not here, sorry, 1, 2, second trophic level, right? So producers are the first trophic level, then we got our primary consumer, second trophic level. Now we got our owl, which is a secondary consumer if we're looking at this food chain, because it is the second one to eat something. Mouse eats, and then the owl eats, so this makes it a secondary consumer, but in the third trophic level, 1, 2, 3, right? The fox right here is a secondary consumer. Grass is a producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, but third trophic level, 1, 2, 3. But check this out. Actually, it might be the same. Producer, primary, secondary. Yep. All right, so anyways, guys, I hope that was helpful. We talked about a lot of different vocab. We went over food chains, food webs, looking at how energy, non-living things interact with living things in an ecosystem. Next week, we'll kind of continue this and go further. All right, guys, see you next time.